Så, välkomna till denna morgon och förmiddag av dialog och workshop på temat forskning inom beslutsfattande, användning och användbarhet. Jag heter Mats Hårsmar, jag är biträdande kanslichef på EBA som är expertgruppen för biståndsanalys. Jag kommer att vägleda er genom morgonens första pass. Det här webbinariet anordnas av SweDev och EBA. SweDev är det svenska nätverket av utvecklingsforskare. Seminariet spelas in och det kommer att läggas upp på våra respektive hemsidor efteråt. So welcome to this morning of dialogue and workshop on the theme Usefulness and Use of Research for Policy and Practice. I will now turn to Swedish, but I will return to English in time for the presentation of our English speaking presenters. Som ni vet så är såväl forskare som beslutsfattare, policymakers, ofta tidspressade. Karaktären i våra olika uppdrag skiljer sig åt och det är inte ovanligt att tidsbrist och olika sätt att närma sig frågeställningar och problem gör att vi talar förbi varandra om vi ens hinner komma till tals. Idag ska vi se om vi kan stärka upp broarna något mellan forskning och policy, forskning och praktik inom området internationellt utvecklingssamarbete. Vi startar med en gemensam session med flera spännande presentationer. Mot slutet hoppas vi hinna med några frågor från er som lyssnar. Skriv dem i chatten så kommer jag läsa upp. Vid klockan 10 kommer vi sedan gå in i 2 separata workshops, men mer om det senare. Först några inledande ord från SweDevs kanslichef Janet Vähämäki, som av en händelse också är ledamot i EBA. Välkommen Janet.
Tack så mycket Mats och god morgon allihop och varmt välkomna till denna dialog om användning och användbarhet av forskning inom beslutsfattande. Och som Mats sa så arrangeras det här seminariet av SweDev som är Swedish Development Research Network och expertgruppen för biståndsanalys EBA. Och jag heter Janet Vähämäki och är kanslichef för SweDev och medlem i EBA. Vi är väldigt glada över det stora engagemang vi ser för denna viktiga fråga och för att just ni är med oss idag för att diskutera nya vägar framåt. Det här är första gången som vi arrangerar den här utvecklingsdialogen och som vi hoppas ska kunna bli ett årligt event. Och jag vill börja med att tacka statssekreterare Janine Alm Eriksson för att du kunde delta i dagens diskussioner. Och vill också tacka Sida för det stöd som SweDev har fått som varit avgörande för lanseringen av nätverket. Det finns en växande efterfrågan på evidensbaserat beslutsfattande och användning av forskning inom det internationella utvecklingssamarbetet. Men det kvarstår fortfarande många hinder för att forskningen faktiskt ska komma till användning i praktiken. Med stöd från EBA så gjorde SweDev förra året en studie och en kartläggning över svensk utvecklingsforskning där 578 svenska utvecklingsforskare deltog. Utvecklingsforskning har ju bedrivits sedan 1960-talet i Sverige, men trots att fältet växt i både storlek och bredd har det funnits väldigt lite samarbete och koordinering forskare och forskningsinstitutioner emellan. Det har lett till att många utvecklingsforskare idag är isolerade, vilket i sin tur försvårar innovation och nytänkande inom forskningen. I en pågående studie så undersöker SweDev hur praktiker använder forskning och vad de ser är hinder för att använda forskning i sitt arbete. Den studien kommer vi lansera i höst. En fråga som tas upp i studien är just den vi ska diskutera idag. Att vad är det som avgör att viss forskning verkar nå fram och annan inte? Och vad är det som är avgörande faktorer för när forskning faktiskt blir användbart? Sammanfattningsvis så visar båda de här studierna vi har gjort att det återstår mycket att göra för att förbättra broskapandet från forskning till praktik och policy. Våra studier visar att det finns ett stort intresse bland forskare och praktiker och det är inte intresset som är bristen Men att det är andra faktorer som finansieringsformer, styrning och tid som är större hinder. I syfte att förbättra interaktionen mellan forskare samt mellan forskare och praktiker så grundades SweDev. Och SweDev vill bidra till framtagande av relevant och tillgänglig forskning för beslutsfattare och praktiker. Vi vill skapa synergier och bättre koordinering bland forskare för att göra forskningen mer tillgänglig och synlig för praktiker inom utvecklingssamarbetet. Vi gör det på många olika sätt, bland annat via vår hemsida som precis nu i dagarna har lanserats. Där bygger vi upp ett register med svenska utvecklingsforskare och sprider den senaste forskningen och utvecklingsnyheterna. Vi gör events som denna för att skapa mötesplatser och dialoger bland både forskare emellan men också med praktiker och beslutsfattare. Vi från SweDev är väldigt glada för samarbetet med EBA. Och nu byter jag hatt till min EBA-hatt. Och som medlem i EBA så kan jag säga att EBA också välkomnar samarbetet med SweDev. Då EBA länge varit i behov av kompetenta forskare inom en rad olika områden för att utföra flera av EBAs studier. Och är glada för att få bättre och starkare anknytning till det svenska forskarsamhället. EBA bygger broar mellan politiker, forskare och praktiker. I samarbete med forskare och andra experter analyserar och utvärderar EBA det svenska biståndet och bidrar med kunskap som kan utveckla och förbättra biståndet samt belyser aktuella frågor och viktiga ämnen som inte fått tillräcklig uppmärksamhet. Vänner och kollegor, jag skulle länge kunna prata om att skapa broar och samarbete mellan forskare och praktiker och vikten av forskningsbaserat beslutsfattande. Men idag har vi bjudit in John Young och Katja Bender som är experter på området och som ska dela med sig av erfarenheter från andra länder. Då vår bedömning är att många andra länder i jämförelse med Sverige kommit längre i samverkan mellan forskare och praktiker. Jag ser också fram emot att höra från er när vi kommer till den andra delen av dagens event med demokrati och SRHR i fokus. Jag hoppas att ni vill dela med er av era tankar och erfarenheter. Och tack igen för att ni är med oss idag och jag hoppas att ni fortsätter att interagera med både SweDev och EBA framöver. Tack så mycket.
Tack så mycket Janette. Och som du snabbt nämnde så har vi den stora glädjen att ha med oss statssekreteraren för internationellt utvecklingssamarbete, Janine Alm Eriksson. Janine, du har en central och avgörande roll för utformningen av svensk utvecklingspolitik. Därför är det ju särskilt glädjande att du vill vara med i det här samtalet om hur forskning och kunskap kan bidra till att stärka politiken. Så Janine, varsågod.
Tack så hemskt mycket och tack för att jag har fått vara med och delta här idag och till SweDev och EBA för att ordna den här konferensen. För det här är ju en väldigt viktig fråga om hur vi kan bli bättre tillsammans. För bättre måste vi ju bli. Det är ju just nu en svår tid, det vet vi alla. Världen har verkligen inte blivit bättre. Trots att vi har målen i Agenda 2030, Parisavtal och annat som ska guida oss. Så är ju det ett väldigt idogt arbete som behöver göras. Där pandemin ju tyvärr har drabbat oss och slagit sönder mycket av den framgång vi har gjort. Så det här arbetet med forskning och utveckling och policyutveckling kommer ju att vara avgörande för att vi ska kunna ta igen de tappen som vi nu har gjort. Regeringens utvecklingspolitiska prioriteringar ligger ju fast, men vi ser ju också att på grund av pandemin så behöver vi jobba annorlunda. Vi har då delat in det arbetet mer i 3 begrepp kan man säga. De är ju sammanflätade och måste göras samtidigt, men vi behöver ju rikta in fokus på pandemin, med vad det innebär med just vaccinationer, hälsovårdssystem som måste byggas. Vi har en omställning som måste göras. Allting som vi gör i återhämtningen måste ju också vara hållbart så att vi använder våra resurser på absolut bästa sätt. Och då är det ju det som är det centrala, hur vi använder det på absolut bästa sätt. Och då måste vi ju stärka politiken med kompetens från forskning och vetenskap. Vi måste bli ännu bättre på att fatta välgrundade beslut på saker som fungerar. Och alla resurser måste kanaliseras mera tydligt. Och där har ju forskningen en ovärderlig roll att spela. Sen tycker jag att det är roligt att dagens konferens ska fokusera på 2 områden som är i regeringens prioriteringar, nämligen SRHR och demokrati. Därför att den svenska feministiska utrikes- och utvecklingspolitiken är ju en jätteviktig del för oss att påverka i världen till det bättre, där SRHR är en grundläggande del. Bristande respekt för sexuella och reproduktiv hälsa och rättigheter är ju också en grundorsak till fattigdom. Även här har ju pandemin påverkat mycket och inverkat väldigt negativt. Förutom sämre tillgång till hälsovård så har ju också det demokratiska utrymmet minskat på många ställen, och det ser vi ju också att då blir tillgången på det här väldigt mycket sämre. Vi har ju också en demokratioffensiv från Sverige. Främjandet av demokrati och mänskliga rättigheter är också en fokuspunkt i vårt arbete och en av huvudprioriteringarna för mandatperioden. Vi vet ju också att utan demokrati, utan fria individer som kan ställa makthavare till svar, så blir ju utvecklingen mycket sämre och människors fulla potential tas inte tillvara. Vi har ju tidigare också konstaterat i Sverige att analys, lärande och erfarenhetsåterföring ska genomföra Sveriges internationella utvecklingssamarbete och humanitära bistånd. Det har vi ju slagit fast i policyramverket. Frågan om bra kommunikation och ömsesidigt lärande mellan forskning och policy är ju också ett återkommande tema. Inte bara i Sverige och inte bara inom utvecklingsforskningen. Men det är väldigt bra att vi sätter lite fokus på den frågan också nu. Forskning, kunskap och analyser om biståndet, liksom global hållbar utveckling, är ju viktigt för också samhällsdebatten. Det är en stor summa pengar som avsätts varje år, och det är viktigt att vi alla som bidrar ser att de pengarna gör nytta och skillnad. Jag vill ta upp klimatområdet som ett viktigt exempel på hur vetenskap systematiskt och lång tid lyft frågan och visat behov på politiskt agerande. Men här har ju forskningen varit väldigt tydlig länge. Redan på 1970-talet lyftes frågan till en, ska man säga, bredare politisk krets. Världen hade sin första FN-konferens om miljö 1972 här i Stockholm. Efter det så har ju politiken ibland, då och då, speciellt kanske i stora brandtal, lyft klimatfrågan. Men väldigt lite har ju blivit politiskt investerat i den. Och det var inte några större förändringar som föreslogs där för 50 år sedan. Ändå så var ju då problemet känt och forskningen väldigt entydig. Och nu står vi här 50 år senare. Massor av konferenser och massor av forskning senare. Och hade politiken vid det tillfället lyssnat mer, haft en mer möjlighet att ta till sig det som forskningen säger, så hade ju situationen sett betydligt bättre ut. Men vi som har samlats här idag har ju ett starkt gemensamt intresse som ser att politik ska vara baserat på evidens och att bra politikutveckling just bygger på det. Det behövs politiker och policyprocesser, politikutvecklingsprocesser som är mottagare av det som forskningen också presenterar. Och när vi är det, då blir det ju en väldigt bra win-win situation. Och därför är ju hur vi gemensamt kan arbeta mot gemensamma mål just en viktig fråga. Det handlar ju dels om mötesplatser för att man ska kunna få ett utbyte som gemensamma plattformar och som det här konferensen idag till exempel. Därför att svensk utvecklingsforskning har ju väldigt mycket att bidra med. Vi behöver ju er som genom rapporter, studier, utvärderingar belyser vad som är bra och vad som inte är så bra. Utvärdering är ju ett avgörande verktyg för att få förbättring, och det behöver vi mer av i politiken. Forskningen är ju dock bredare än så, men är också ett viktig del. Kompetens- och kunskapsförmedling och delning ställer ju också krav på båda sidor. Det kräver en viss tydlighet och pedagogik för att de forskningsrön som har tagits fram också ska kunna vara mottagliga. Men det kräver ju också verkligen intresserade och nyfikna politiker. På båda sidorna handlar det om att identifiera behov av forskning och ny kunskap, så att man kan utvecklas tillsammans och drivs av en vilja till bättre resultat. För det är ju det som vi har gemensamt. Och som ni vet så sa ju Olof Palme att politik är att vilja. Och så är det ju. Men det måste ju också finnas kunskap om hur man når dit man vill. Vad som fungerar och vad som inte fungerar. Där är ju en kontinuerlig dialog helt nödvändig. Och forskningens arbete också helt vital. Sen behöver forskningsrönen paketeras på ett sätt som lätt kan läsas, förstås och användas för att utveckla politiken. Det handlar ju också om att ha en förståelse för policymiljön, förutsättningar och processer. Men här vill jag lyfta just EBA, expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, som ju har en viktig roll, som samarbetar med forskare och experter för att sammanfatta existerande kunskap och ta fram ny kunskap som också är relevant för svenskt bistånd. Då har ju att det finns en kontinuerligt utbyte gör ju att vi i politiken får till oss väldigt mycket saker som är avgörande just för utvecklingen av politik. Men det handlar också om generell tillgång på kompetenser. Att vi har forskningskompetens på regeringskansliet, på Sida. Och att vi har policykompetens inom forskarsamhället. Det här är ju en bredare fråga om rekryterings- och karriär. Och att man ska kunna ha en viss mobilitet mellan policy och forskning. Och det är tyvärr en bristvara i Sverige. Där hoppas vi att vi kommer få se mer framöver och att det måste löna sig karriärmässigt att ha erfarenhet från andra sidan. Vi har ju dock ett väldigt bra exempel på det här i Sverige. Och jag vill passa på att lyfta fram Cecilia Malmström som ju är en forskare, väldigt duktig statsvetare men som också har varit och är en väldigt duktig och kompetent politiker. Sånt behöver vi mer av. Lite snabbt bara det sista om vad politiken gör för utvecklingsforskningen. Vi stödjer ju framförallt genom Vetenskapsrådet men också utvecklingsforskning utanför Sverige. Cirka 50% av Sidas insatser inom den så kallade forskningsstrategin går till globala aktörer som bedriver forskning inom hälsa, lantbruk, ekonomi med flera frågor. Cirka 15% går till regionala aktörer. Cirka 35% går till bilaterala insatser inom för närvarande 7 programländer, varav 5 i Afrika. Och stödet går till både forskning och kapacitetsstärkande som bibliotek, administrativa resurser och forskningsråd. Sverige är också ett föregångsland inom bilaterala insatser som vägleds av principer som lokalt ägande, uthållighet, ambitioner att på ett hållbart sätt stärka forskningssystem på sikt. Den svenska modellen inom forskningsstödet har väckt intresse bland annat inom EU. Och det här är ett arbete som vi önskar fortsätta. Vi fattade nyligen beslut om anvisningar för just en ny forskningsstrategi. Den nuvarande löper ut vid årsskiftet. Och vi ser fram emot att få underlag från Sida och Vetenskapsrådet i augusti. Vi hoppas att regeringen kan fatta beslut om en ny strategi före årets slut. Vi ser ett brett engagemang av forskarsamhället i anslutning till beredningen och det är viktigt. Och dialog med Sida och Vetenskapsrådet är vi glada för. Det är de som tar fram underlaget som sedan ligger till grund för framtagandet i höst. Svensk forskning är också en resurs för att bygga relationer med länder efter att bistånd fasas ut. Det är det vi kallar för bredare relationer och innefattar en bredd av svenska resurser såsom företagande, kultur, vetenskap och civilsamhälle. Vi känner det starka intresset bland svenska forskare och studenter för utvecklingsfrågor. Det är otroligt bra. Det är en resurs som vi från politiken vill samverka med, liksom fortsätta att engagera i utvecklingssamarbetet. Och för tillsammans så kan vi förbättra både politiken och utvecklingen. Tack.
Tack så jättemycket, Janine. Det här var ju vi får se det som en början på en dialog som absolut behöver fortsätta. Och det var ju väldigt många bra inspel där. Men jag tror att vi faktiskt går vidare i vårt program direkt för att vi ska hinna med det som vi har framför oss här. So I now turn to English. There is one person in Europe that maybe more than others have thought about and worked on the issue of bridging research and policy. For some 20 years, John Young led the so-called RAPID program, Research and Policy in Development at ODI in London. But since a couple of years back, you're now executive director at INASP, originally spelled out as the International Network for the Availability of Scientific Publications, but nowadays an organization that promotes research and knowledge at the heart of development more widely. We're extremely happy to have you with us, John. Please, the screen is yours.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Mats, and I'm very happy to be here. Let me just get this going. Great, so thanks a lot. Great to be here. I'm going to talk a bit about myself, although Mats has done most of that for me already, so that's easy. I'll talk then a little bit about development research, the kind of impact it can have and the return on investment it can have. Then talk about how change happens, particularly in developing countries, and then as a researcher, how to engage with that process of change in order to try and maximize the impact of your research on policy and practice. So I'm going to cover quite a lot of ground quite quickly. You'll see many links to further information on the slides. I'll share the slides afterwards. So don't worry about writing things down or missing things. You can always look it all up afterwards. So Mats has already talked about this, really worked in ODI for 20 years, nearly 20 years, and that's for the last 2 years. Before that, I was 15 years in Africa, Asia and Southeast Asia, working on policy issues, trying to get pilot projects scaled up. So working on how to get research into policy before this. And basically what I do is try to promote greater production and use of research-based evidence in development policy and practice. And research can have a fantastic impact. This is a trial plot of the rice variety called IR36, developed by the International Rice Research Institute in the 70s. It took about 15 years to develop, but it's now the most widely grown variety of any food crop worldwide. 11 million hectares are grown, 65% of the rice grown in Asia, and it's enabled Asian farmers to harvest an additional 5 million tons of rice each year and earn an additional $1 billion annually. So fantastically important research with huge impact. Much smaller pieces of research can also have a very impressive impact. This is another example of a piece of research. This is the Tanzania Essential Health Interventions Project, funded by Canadian CEDA, implemented by IDRC in Tanzania. All they did was they did disease prevalence surveys in 2 specific districts they were working in Tanzania, and then they modified the normal health program to take account of the disease prevalence in those 2 districts, and they achieved a 46% reduction in infant mortality in just 3 years. So also at a much smaller scale, having a very substantial impact. And the rate of return can be huge. This is the results of some work done by the Redstone Strategy, which is a US consultancy firm which specializes in assessing the impact of policy advocacy programs. They looked at some work done by the Indian Institute of Dalit Studies. Dalits are untouchables, the very lowest caste in India, which had contributed to a change in policy in the University Grants Commission to increase the number of places reserved for Dalits by 15% to 350,000 per year. And they calculated that would result in an increased income for the Dalit community of $2.3 billion. The research cost $250,000, return to investment 9,000 to 1. They also did a sort of what they called a contribution analysis, how much of this policy change could be attributed to the research which was done by the Indian Institute of Dialect Studies, which they worked out to be 53%. So even then, you've got a rate of return of 5,000 to 1. So the right kind of research done in the right kind of way can have a massive, massive impact and be a really, really good investment. The challenge is that the problems we're facing in the world are very complex problems. They're much more complex than producing new strains of rice or improving health services or reserving more places for Dalits at university. And here are some of them. These sorts of problems are often called wicked problems because they're complex. Many factors contribute to them. They're very difficult to solve. Simple solutions in one element often cause problems elsewhere. And long-term solutions nearly always involve social and political change. And there's simply not enough time for traditional academic research to come up with solutions to these problems. And if you want to address problems like this, you really need to understand the context you're working in and how things happen. And things happen completely differently in different contexts. So this is a picture from India, and this cow in the middle of the road in India knows that all drivers will swerve to avoid the cow. The cow is completely safe because the rules of the road in India are that you shouldn't hit anything in front of you, particularly if it's a cow. Completely different to the rules of the road in Britain and Sweden, which is where we're taught to avoid doing anything that might cause any other vehicle to change its speed and direction. So animals in the road don't live very long, but the accident rate between vehicles is very much lower. And it's only by understanding these sort of written and unwritten rules of the game, the way that things happen, is it possible to achieve a sustainable change? And that is very difficult. And one of the reasons it's difficult is because there is no universal policy process. And if you're trying to influence policy, you need to understand the policy process, the way in which decisions are made. It's certainly not linear and logical, which is one model. Is probably not neatly circular and cyclical like it is in this picture, but this is the most commonly recognized form of sort of policy cycle, policy formulation, decision-making, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, although there's surprisingly little of that in many places, and then agenda setting, and it goes round and round. And there are, of course, many different organizations and groups involved in this process, some with responsibilities throughout. The cabinet should really be focusing at agenda setting and policy making, but actually lots and lots of organizations involved in lots and lots of different parts of this policy process. And of course, what happens is that particularly over the last 15, 20 years, development donors have been trying to influence not only the policy process, but all the other stakeholders involved in the policy process. Not surprisingly, developing country governments have been getting their own back, and very soon everybody is trying to influence everybody. And you have what we used to call a chaotic situation. What we discovered was that the chaos word was deeply unpopular, particularly with policymakers. So now what we tend to say is complex, multifactorial and non-linear, and everybody seems to be quite happy with that description. So if you're trying to do research in this kind of environment, what's the best way of doing it? Well, I think the best way of doing it is what some people call transdisciplinary research. Other people call it convergent science. Other people call it operational research. Lots of different words for it. I'll try and explain how it's different to normal research. So in disciplinary research, you have people in different disciplines researching interesting academic questions in their discipline, and they publish papers which very few people read. In multidisciplinary research, you have researchers from different disciplines working within their disciplinary areas, sometimes on related questions, and sometimes they get together in conferences and share the results, and sometimes sensible decisions are made. Then you have interdisciplinary research. This is where it starts to get interesting, where different types of researchers collaborate together to explore the same research question. They share methodologies and approaches, and they collaborate in terms of doing the research and analyzing the results of the research. And transdisciplinary research is where they do that on an issue in collaboration with all the other stakeholders in the process. So with policymakers, private sector, practitioners, communities, trying to solve a common problem. What's the problem here? what do we already know, what don't we know, what do we need to know more about, and the researchers then focus on that last bit, what do we know more about? And there's a process to it. So first of all, convening the different stakeholders, identifying the problem, then doing collaborative research, and then two very important stages, co-analysis of the results. So it's not just the academics deciding what this means and publishing papers, it's actually sitting down with these other stakeholders to think about, well, what does this tell us about this problem? And then co-production of recommendations, deciding, okay, what can be done about this to try and solve this problem. While I was in ODI, we developed a kind of approach to doing transdisciplinary research for researchers, just to try and identify the sort of stages and different tools that could be useful at different parts of the process. And we broke it down into three stages. One we called diagnosing the problem. Secondly, developing a strategy to do the research to address that problem. And the third stage, developing a monitoring and learning plan to check you're on track to actually find a solution to that problem. And there are lots and lots of tools. I'm just going to talk very briefly about three of them. And if you want to know more about this, there's a link there that you can find out much more about it. So the first tool I'm going to talk about is a tool we call the alignment, interest, and influence matrix. It's essentially a stakeholder mapping tool to try and identify who are the key stakeholders who are involved in this question, and how do they map, first of all, onto these two dimensions, how much they agree with what the kind of policy, what the research you've done so far indicates might be the right direction to go with, and how much are they interested in that problem. So you can immediately, you identify all the stakeholders, you can immediately start to put them into these quadrants. So there are people who broadly agree and who are interested, and you can work in partnership with those people. Those are your natural partners. There are people who are interested but don't agree, and they're the people you must work to persuade. There are people who broadly agree but are not terribly interested. If you can get them interested, you can co-opt them and they can work with you in partnership to try and address this problem. And the people who don't agree with you and are not interested, and you can more or less forget them, they're not going to make much difference. So that's the first two dimensions. The next two dimensions are very important. The first of those is how much power do any of these people have? There's no point wasting time trying to work with people who have little power. So that's the third dimension. Identify the powerful stakeholders in each of these quadrants that you want to work with. And the fourth question is, and what ability do we have to actually engage with those people? And you may well not have the ability to engage with the most powerful stakeholders, but you can engage with the second or the third most powerful stakeholders. So by going through this process, you can really start to identify, well, who are the key people or the key stakeholder groups we need to engage with if we want to try and solve this problem. So that's part of the diagnosing the problem bit. Lots of other tools you can find out in the guidebook. And then once you've identified the people and you've identified the problem, then how do you figure out what you need to do? And one of the tools that we've used quite a lot is this tool, force field analysis, developed by Kurt Lewin in the States in the 30s. He was working on child welfare as a way of understanding how can child welfare be improved. And basically, you put what you try and achieve in the middle. You figure out on one side, well, what are the things which are preventing this from happening, the negative forces. On the other side, you put, well, what are the positive forces which are moving in this direction, and identify them. And then again, as a researcher, you can think about, well, which of these forces can we engage with? Which of these do we need to know more about? And how can we do our research in a way which is going to maximize the positive forces and minimize the negative forces? And the third stage in the whole process is what we call the sort of monitoring and learning. And it really is, if you're involved in this kind of research, you don't know what the end result's going to be. You know broadly which direction you should be going in collaboration with lots of other stakeholders. You need to check you're on track and be able to change track if what you're doing is not achieving what you want to achieve. And so we think that in order to be sure you're on track to contribute to what you're trying to contribute to, you need to be looking at 7 different levels. One is the strategy. Are you doing the right thing? And how do you know you're doing the right thing? Management. Are you doing what you plan to do? projects very often start saying they're going to do this and end up doing something different. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you need to understand why that change happened. Are you doing what you plan to do? Are you producing the right kinds of outputs for the audience that you're seeking to engage with? Are they aware of the work that you're doing? Is that actually having any impact on the way that they behave, which is another way of defining policy? Is that improving people's lives? And then, very important, continually monitoring the context around what else could be influencing this change. The changes you observe may not be anything to do with what you're doing. It may be to do with what's happening outside. So you need to be looking at all of these things as the research progresses to make sure that you are broadly on track to achieve what you want to try and achieve. And there are lots and lots of different tools to do all of these different things. I'm sure you'll recognize many of these words, and I'm not going to talk more about any of them now. And it can be very complex. You can, for a very big project, you might have quite a complex monitoring and evaluation framework using many of these tools. For a very simple project, you may just have a very few simple tools, so it's scalable. And if you want to know more about any of these tools and how to put them together for research programs of different sizes, I suggest you download this guidebook produced by some colleagues of mine from ODI. What this means, of course, is that if you want to do research which has impact, you need to be more than a good researcher. You need to be a good researcher. The policy engagement work that we should do should be based on sound research. And this is, as I'm sure you all know, this is a marty ascent. So that you obviously need to do high quality research, but you also need to be a really good storyteller. You need to be able to distill the results of your research down into very simple and appealing messages for the different stakeholders, different messages for different stakeholders, so that they can understand what you're learning, what's going on, what this means, etc. And this, in case you're wondering, is a picture of Scheherazade telling the Sultan the story one night so that he didn't cut off her head the next morning, and after 1001 nights he married her. So you need to be a bit of a Scheherazade. You need to be a really good networker. Obviously, you need to know all the different stakeholders in the process. You need to be Simon Maxwell actually came up with this idea. It's not my idea. Simon Maxwell, who was the director of ODI when I was there, he came up with this idea. You need to be a good engineer. And this is a picture of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, one of the UK's most famous industrial revolution engineers. You need to be constructing programs looking into the future. What is the problem that is likely to emerge so that you can start doing research, can start moving in the right direction before the questions get asked about what do we do about this problem, so that you can have something useful to say. And you also need to be a bit of what Simon Maxwell called a fixer. This is Rasputin. You need to understand the politics of the change process, who's making the decisions, how to get to them, what kind of information will influence them, etc. So you need to be a bit of a policy entrepreneur. And often when I talk about this to researchers, their faces fall because they're thinking, you know, it's difficult enough just doing really high quality research, and now you expect me to do all these other things as well. Well, you don't need to have all of these skills yourself, but in the team that you're working with, or the collaborators you collaborate with, you need to try and make sure that you have this range of skills so that the high quality research can have some impact. And of course, researchers are not the only actors on this stage. They're not the only players in this process. There's a whole load of other stakeholders involved in how knowledge is generated and used. This is a picture from our strategies many years ago. It's got our vision in the middle, research and knowledge at the heart of development, and all the other different actors around that are involved in this. So civil service training colleges, professional associations, library consortia, media, national, international. We call this a knowledge ecosystem. And what the recent COVID crisis has really demonstrated beyond any doubt is that countries need to have a vibrant, thriving, sustainable, local knowledge ecosystem if they're going to be able to deal with the challenges which they're facing. And so as a researcher, we should be trying to do our work in ways which build and strengthen this ecosystem rather than undermine it. And the problem is there are very many different factors which are actually undermining, are fragmenting knowledge ecosystems, particularly in the global south. So most of the research funding actually goes to universities in the global north. That which does go to the south tends to go to elite universities in capital cities. So that undermines the knowledge ecosystem in that country. Women find it very difficult to pursue scientific careers, particularly in the south. Societal norms tend to keep them at home looking after children. If they do get into university, schedules are inflexible. No time for childcare, they have less time to write papers, etc. So they often miss out on publications. So there are gender issues which undermine this ecosystem. Most of the well-known development researchers are actually northern, and the voices of southern researchers are frequently not heard. And this has all been made much worse by the COVID crisis, while northern and elite universities in the global south have been able to switch to online learning. Many, especially early career researchers in the global south, don't even have access to the internet when they're not in their university. So COVID is actually exacerbating all of this. So what we believe is that for research and knowledge to be at the heart of development, you need what we call equitable knowledge ecosystems. And these are ecosystems where men and women have equal access to skills, knowledge and careers in research, policy or practice, where all academic and policy organizations have equal access to resources and knowledge, and they create the conditions for staff to produce and use knowledge, where all forms of knowledge are considered equally important. I've talked mainly about research-based knowledge now, but actually in trying to solve these complex problems I was talking about, other forms of knowledge are really important. Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, experiential knowledge. These are all really important forms of knowledge to try and find solutions to these problems, as well as research-based knowledge. And also where mechanisms exist for all stakeholders to collaborate to find evidence-based solutions to problems. So we need to try and build these equitable knowledge ecosystems in the countries we work in. And that's what we try and do in ASP. This is our theory of change, showing how we're trying to do that. So in the middle, this little pentagram, it shows the different organizations, different types of knowledge which are involved in the knowledge ecosystem. And what we do on the left-hand side is we support individuals to produce, communicate, and use knowledge, organizations to help them to create supportive environments for individuals to work in, and the entire knowledge ecosystem to ensure that the rules of the game, if you like, in the knowledge ecosystem actually support that ecosystem. And the idea is that we get more robust and more relevant research to improve lives. So what can you do as a researcher if you want to maximize the impact of your research? Well, I would say do the right research. Do research which is challenge-driven and developmental rather than academically driven. Challenge-driven developmental research. Do it in the right way, transdisciplinary research, be politically aware, but be patient. It takes a long time. And step by step, you'll get there, but do it in the right way. Obviously, in collaboration with partners, particularly in the global south, and promote equity. So choosing your partners, don't always choose, the best known names and the best known universities. There are lots and lots of other good researchers in the global south who can also contribute substantially to your project. Form equitable partnerships with those organizations. Sweden has been much better at this than many other countries like my own in promoting equitable partnerships. But in the UK, for example, there are very, very many examples of northern researchers who regard their southern colleagues simply as data collectors. They collect the data and then the northern researcher writes the paper and publish it. And sometimes the southern partners' names don't even appear on the paper. So build equitable partners with your researchers in the global south and do the work in ways which builds their capacity to do research themselves rather than undermines it. And I remember some time ago in ODI, we were working with a range of southern think tanks ODI, we were working with a range of southern think tanks, and we organized a meeting in the days when we could travel. Everybody came to London, and one of the directors of these think tanks stood up in the meeting and said to Simon Maxwell, who was brilliant, who came up with this policy entrepreneur concept I talked about earlier on. And he said, you know, Simon, the problem with ODI is that you're so elitist. You want to be at the cutting edge of everything. You want to work with us, but you only ever let us write the boxes in the report. We want to work with you on the whole report. So that's why I say equitable partnerships and building capacity. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. Fascinating. Just a follow-up question coming from the audience here. Role of political parties in your stakeholder mapping there. What about them? Were they not included in your picture? And how do you see political parties in this whole thing?
Well, they're certainly there. They're certainly very important stakeholders. The role that political parties play in evidence-based policymaking processes is different in different contexts at different times. Sometimes they can help and sometimes they can hinder. It's very often said that actually, if you're working on social policy, it is the party in waiting that is often the party which is most interested in finding solutions to problems which the party in power is not finding. So, for example, in the UK, there are a couple of very well-known think tanks, IPPR and Demos, were very left-leaning, Labour-affiliated think tanks who were very instrumental in some of the research which went into the policies which were promoted by New Labour in 1997. So they're very important, and understanding what they're doing at any particular point in time is very important before deciding how and if to work with them. One of the things that Simon Maxwell always used to say in ODI, in terms of ODI as a research organization with credibility, is it was very important not to show any kind of political partisanship. So he always made sure he had wide representation of different parties on the board, for example, and included people from different parties in the public meetings. So they're important, and there are very many different ways of working with them to maximize the chance of you having any kind of impact.
So thank you. This is fascinating, and a lot of questions emerging here, but we have to move on. So thank you, John. This is something we'll have to come back to this discussion, I think, in some form. We are continuing to get a flavor of what happens in other parts of Europe, and I turn to Katja Bender, who is professor at the International Center for Sustainable Development at the Bonn-Rhein-Sieg University of Applied Sciences. You're also vice president of the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes, EADI, where you're also involved in a study on research practice collaborations. What are the perceptions and experiences of researchers in various parts of Europe about this? Please, Katja, tell us more about what you've found so far.
Okay, thank you for this introduction, Mats. And I just moved to sharing my full screen. 1 second.
It's coming.
It's coming, great. So now, yeah, so now I'm set, I hope. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me today. And it's really a pleasure for me to be here today. Yeah, before I start with my presentation, maybe briefly, a few words, but very briefly, to my background, or first concerning the EADI, the European Association for Development Research and Training Institutes, because I'm not alone here, I've seen. And this nicely shows also the interconnectedness of the different networks. So actually Henning Melber, the president of EADI, and Elin Bjarnegard, the former Swedish representative of EADI, are also here. So it's a part of a subgroup of EADI being here today. At EADI, we are now working at also building the pillar with respect to research practice collaboration, transdisciplinary research. So it has not been, well, of course, we are engaged in different forms of research practice collaboration, but it has not yet been systematized in our work at EADI. So, and what I'm going to present today is the first outcome, first step towards this endeavor. Maybe also a few words on my personal background. I have been working on both sides of the table, so to say, as a development practitioner and a researcher, and always very close to the interface between policy practice and research. So this is an area which is also personally also of great interest to me. So today I'm going to present some selected perspectives from academia, actually on transdisciplinary research. So perspectives on research practice collaborations. And let me start with a few words on the terminology in order to avoid any confusion. If I use the word practice, I use it in a very broad term, actually meaning everyone outside academia. So this includes policymakers, public agencies, NGOs, business, everyone not working in academia. In our study, we also differentiated between different types of practitioners, but first of all, it's a very broad term. And as John also mentioned in his presentations, when we talk about, well, these types of research practice collaborations, there are multiple terminologies: transdisciplinary research, co-production of knowledge, collaborative research. And we just use this neutral term, research practice collaborations, so not in order to step into any different discourses related to this type of research. So the background to what I'm going to present today is a study, as you also mentioned, Mats, we conducted in 2019, 2020. We comprises a group of different colleagues, and the study is called Roles, Processes and Risk within the Research Practice Nexus, Perspectives from Academia. What I'm going to talk about today is not about the entire report which we produced, but just a brief snapshot. And I would in particular like to focus on two aspects concerning the perspectives from academia. So sort of changing a bit the perspective, now asking how do researchers perceive the impact of research collaborations on different dimensions of research quality. I will talk about research quality in a moment. And then moving away from this level of, well, impact or outcome, however you define it, to the level of processes. So looking into the inner workings of these types of collaborations. And I'm not going much into the methodology right now. We have basically, it relies on qualitative interviews, in-depth interviews, and on a survey sample. So unfortunately, the response rate was rather low. We expected more, so we only have something like 52 responses. And I think that is also important when interpreting the results. Of course, they are, well, they are not representative in any way. So most likely we have a bias sample. I'm also coming to that. But I think they can provide some anecdotal evidence, and maybe then also offer the opportunity as an input for discussion if these results fit to your experience or not, if they are completely contrary. Okay, so I would like to start now with the perceived impact on research quality. And if we talk about transdisciplinary research or co-production of research or however we call it. There are different definitions of research quality, but there is one common denominator. All definitions go beyond methodological soundness of research or validity of research and include more dimensions. So, and here we opted for 3 dimensions. So first dimension, credibility. This is basically related to the quality of methods applied, adhering to scientific standards. We also added saliency. That is the perceived relevance of scientific knowledge outside academia, what is actually one of the ultimate purposes of transdisciplinary research, and also included well, more normative dimension, ethical dimension, legitimacy, relating to the fairness and ethical conduct of research. So is legitimacy improved by offering more voice to different people, or do maybe practitioners and researchers collude to further their own interest? So these are questions relevant with respect to legitimacy. So, and now if we look at the results, we ask people how they would assess the impact, positive or strongly positive, neutral or negative. And as you can see, the results are quite positive, specifically with respect to saliency. 92% of respondents perceived research practice collaboration as having a positive or strongly positive impact on saliency, so on the relevance of scientific knowledge outside academia. And well, it is not as the results are not as striking when coming to saliency and legitimacy, but still a majority considered research practice collaboration as also having a positive or strongly positive impact on credibility and legitimacy. And only few, very few responses noted that negative impact. So this is quite well, positive picture. And maybe here it would also be relevant to add that most, that is one way our sample is also biased, that most of the respondents have quite substantial experience in research practice collaborations. We also wanted to get some without, but well, we didn't, not so many. Likewise, respondents were also asked if they would consider actually social impact creation also as a researcher's responsibility. And here you see, I mean, I think it's even more striking, again, a very, well, positive attitude, or that 81% of respondents either agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. So if we take these results, I think it's possible to conclude that we do have a group of respondents who actually are very open to transdisciplinary research and have positive associations with transdisciplinary research or research practice collaborations. So, and still, even though we do have these positive attitudes, if we move to the process level, it also becomes clear that research practice collaborations are not without challenges. Would be surprising if they are. And you, John, you also very nicely presented already what is, I mean, what one has to accomplish in a team in order to conduct successful transdisciplinary research. So if we look at the processes in RP, in research practice collaborations, it's getting, well, a little more challenging. And I think that is also not, that should not come as a surprise. Then, well, research practice collaborations are not just a technocratic endeavor, but are always intrinsically political. Different persons come together with a different interest. These interests might conflict. So we have what we call in social science as collective action situation. And so first of all, let us start looking at research consumption of research practice collaborations compared to research projects, which are also carried out with multiple actors, but involving researchers only. And again, the overwhelming majority considered research practice collaboration as more ambitious. They are more time consuming, they are slightly more difficult to manage, and specifically with respect to the communication efforts, they involve considerably higher communication efforts. So we also have, yeah.
Can I ask you to wind up?
I'm almost done. I'm almost done.
Thank you.
So we do have higher transaction costs. Secondly, they are also not conflicts free, and we ask for, and you see quite a couple of conflicts are present. But if we look at the type of conflicts which are present, which are most frequently present and maybe also threaten project success, all of these are more or less related to, well, more different professional environments and different contextual backgrounds. So like no shared concept, lack of shared understanding of goals, different organizational contexts. So it's a lot about communication problems, getting to know each other. And maybe just quickly, coming back to the impact on research credibility, respondents also noted various channels how these research practice collaborations might enhance the credibility of research. So that is also, I mean, looking at this feedback process, it's considered as quite positive. But one critical challenge which was mentioned by a majority is that practitioners often are perceived to have, well, difficulties in understanding scientific approaches, and that this lack of understanding might even threaten success. And now I'm coming to the conclusion. So basically the point is that looking at the different transaction problems and conflicts, it's a lot about communication, a lot of understanding different contexts. So yes, those collaborations are more difficult to manage, so maybe we need longer timeframes, higher funding requirements, but there is also a social dimension. It also requires how we behave and how towards each other. So mutual awareness of difference in professional environments seems to be important. And also, like you pointed out, John, patience is important, and also openness to learning, openness to changing perspective. And let me conclude with another quote, which I'm not going to read out, but which basically also summarizes that maybe we should move away from always thinking about impacts only, but also thinking about how these collaboration might change our perspectives, how this might change our own understandings and enhance our own understandings. So thank you very much for your attention. So that's it. And I also gave my contact details here if you would like to get in touch.
Thank you so much, Katja. I'm sorry for stressing you. It wasn't my fault there. You might have noticed that there are quite a few interesting questions emerging in the chat room. So take a look there. We don't have time to raise them right now because we are moving on. So I would like to direct a very warm thanks to those of you who have participated here in the first session, and to a quartet that might be mixed up for a music group from the 60s or something. So thank you, Jeanette, Janine, John, and Katja. We are now moving on to 2 workshops. Vi fortsätter nu i 2 separata workshops. De kommer att utgå från de teman som ni har valt, demokrati och SRHR, sexuella och reproduktiva hälsa och rättigheter. Joakim Molander kommer att moderera workshopen om demokratifrågor. Han är EBA-ledamot och metodchef på internationella IDEA. Den andra workshopen om SRHR kommer att modereras av Sara Österlund som är senior policyrådgivare på RFSU. Och de kommer nu att guida er vidare under den här förmiddagen. Jonathan kommer att dela upp oss i grupper och jag misstänker att vi kan ta kanske 2 minuters bensträckningspaus i samband med att den här uppdelningen sker. Kan det vara så, Jonathan?